Today we're diving into another top hit of the piano classics. We're taking a look at Chopin's Fourth Prelude in E minor. Much like the tutorials that I have for Satie's Gymnopédie and for Beethoven's Für und Liese, this is going to be a series of tutorials, and this is lesson 1, so welcome, thanks for stopping by. And today we're going to be looking at some preliminary steps when you're first getting started with this piece, what you can look at before you get started. Maybe you have some pieces that you're finishing up that you're not quite ready to start on this piece, but it's kind of been in the back of your mind. You've been thinking, I think I'd like to learn that piece. If that's where you're at, that's perfect, because we're not going to do a lot of playing in this piece today. We're going to be walking through several of the elements that you should keep in mind as you're getting started. And of course, we're going to learn some exercises that will help you hit the ground running when you are ready to start this piece. And if you are already working on this piece, or if you do know that you want to start playing it today, that's also great. You can still take all of this information and use it to help you plan out your practicing. And you can use the exercises to help you kind of move your technique forward so that you're ready to really face the challenges of this piece without necessarily having to sit down and do a lot of reading at the piano. So of course, the first step when we're approaching a piece is to look at the key signature, make sure that you're really clear on what key you're dealing with. I already said it at the beginning, this prelude is in E minor, which means that you should be practicing your E minor scale on a daily basis, best case scenario, or at least every time that you sit down to practice the piece. Even if you're already familiar with your E minor scales, I want to make sure that you're practicing them at least once a week. And yes, I did say scales, plural. We of course have 3 different versions of our minor scale. I would recommend starting probably with just the natural minor and the harmonic minor. You can find shorts walking you through those if you need information about the notes that you need to play, the fingerings that you should be using. That will get you started on those. If you want to walk through the chords, the main chords that you'll be seeing, this piece is quite chromatic, so walking through these chords might not help you out as much in the early phases of learning, just because there are a lot of different chords that pop up in this piece. But if you want to have a look, when we're playing an E minor, the most common chords that we will see are, of course, an E minor chord, E, G, B, an A minor chord, A, C, E, and then our dominant in E minor is B major, B, D sharp, F sharp, and then from there you can go back to E minor. You can also play those in inversions. That's sort of the classical warm-up after you've played your scale. You go into this form of playing the chords. However you want to approach those. Then we need to look at our time signature. In the music that I have in front of me, it's written in common time, so there's just a C at the beginning. Common time just means 4/4 time, so we have 4 beats per measure, and quarter notes are our main beat that we're keeping track of. One thing worth noting in this piece is that we do start with a pickup, so that means the first measure is not a complete measure. Typically, that should actually be subtracted from the last measure, but I have whole notes written out here, and I think that is what I've always seen in this music. So as you can see, composers don't even play by the rules all the time. Everybody's human. Somehow nice to know, right? But what this pickup means is we have the first measure actually only has 1 beat. And if you're counting, like I hope you are when you're practicing, then you would count that 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1. Everything after that pickup moves normally. It's just important to know that we're not starting on beat 1 and then repeating beat 1 in the next measure. It's always working backwards from the end of that measure. So if we're supposed to have 4 beats and we have 2 beats, then you're going to start on beat 3 and play beats 3, 4, and then the next measure starts on 1. Here, we're starting on the 4th beat. There's only 1 measure in our pickup. Then you know the drill. If you've seen some of my other tutorials, I also always suggest looking at the tempo marking, not because you need to sit down and play right in performance speed the first time through, but just so that you kind of know exactly what you're working towards. This tempo is marked as largo. That means slowly. It actually literally means long, if I'm not mistaken. I usually use my Spanish to cheat on my Italian, so hopefully it's not leading me astray here, but I believe that that would be the literal translation. The main thing to know is it's slow. So we have this very kind of, we're in E minor, we have this tragic atmosphere, just very melancholy, very typical for Chopin, very expected from him. From there, we should check what we have going on with the pedal. And in one edition that I have, there are absolutely no pedal markings. In this edition, it says tenuto sempre. And then there's a little footnote at the bottom that basically says, this piece will use a lot of pedal. Make sure that you're changing every time the harmony changes, which is a very good rule of thumb in this piece. Even if you have an edition that doesn't have any pedal marked, it is assumed when we're playing Chopin or any composer from the Romantic era that we will be playing with pedal unless they explicitly tell us not to. The Romantic era is really kind of the golden age of piano music. This is when the modern piano really comes into being. What Beethoven would have been composing for wasn't quite like the modern instrument that we have today. The keys were a bit lighter, the sound was a bit different, but by the time Chopin and Liszt come along, and particularly Brahms, then we really have this style of piano that the composers were very much keeping in mind, and they were constantly playing with pedal. There would really only be a very few exceptions. So don't think that just because pedal isn't marked in your music that you shouldn't play with pedal. I hear from students a lot like, do I use pedal? It's not marked, what do I do? Absolutely use pedal, 100%. And once you have that quick overview, then you of course scan through the entire piece and start to just ask yourself, what do I see? If you want a long list of questions that you can be asking yourself, I've linked to a PDF below that walks you through those steps. I have an entire tutorial on how to approach learning new pieces, and use those as much as you need or want for guidance on this important topic. But for now, let's just go over a few brief things that we see in this piece. So for example, the left hand has eighth notes almost through the entire piece. We have a lot of chords. Most of the time they're repeating, they're changing every measure or half measure. Every now and then we change once every beat, but most of the time we have several chords in a row, like the same chord repeating several times in a row, and moving really consistently with eighth notes. There are a few exceptions to this. For example, there's one spot where the right hand has a more active melody. The right hand has a lot of eighth notes and the left hand just has a quarter note on the first beat. And then right at the very end, we have half notes in both hands for two measures, and then it wraps up on a whole note. So besides those few exceptions, the left hand is really active in a sense of it has this plodding sort of pattern in the left hand. It's not moving around a lot, but it is essential to the atmosphere of this piece. So that's something that you can keep in mind from the very beginning. The right hand is what is the melody in this piece. It's okay if that's not obvious to you at the first glance, but that is the case. And that means that the right hand is really going to be having this beautiful singing line, and it's actually fairly static. So the left hand has these eighth notes that are repeating, but the right hand has lots of dotted half notes followed by quarter notes throughout most of the piece. There are just a few exceptions when the right hand gets a bit more active and has a little bit more going on, mostly at sort of the high points of the phrases. And then the other thing that you might notice about how the notes are moving around in this piece is the right hand starts with this octave jump, but then spends several measures just stepping around with half steps. We have B, C, B, C, B, C, B, B flat, A, B, A, B, A, B, A. So in terms of reading, the right hand is actually fairly straightforward, except for those parts where we have a lot of eighth notes going on. The reading is quite simple for the right hand. The left hand has really fat chords through most of the piece, and so that has its own challenges. Also, it's a nice challenge for the bass clef. It's going to force you to be very active in the bass clef, which is fun, I think, I hope. Then from here, let's move on to a few exercises that will help you hit the ground running with this piece. Or if you've already started the piece and you feel like you're struggling with a few things, these might hit some of the key points that you've been dealing with. First and foremost, I mentioned before that the left hand has a lot going on in terms of reading. We have some big fat chords, and learning how to navigate reading these can be a bit difficult, or overwhelming is maybe a better way to put it, because the notes in and of themselves for the most part are fairly straightforward to find. There are maybe one or two exceptions to that. We'll cross that bridge when we get to it as well. But the main thing that I would encourage you here is when you're reading these big chords, read from the bottom to the top at least most of the time. That's going to help you. Anytime we have something that's overwhelming with reading, if we learn to approach it systematically, our lives are going to be much simpler. And so, for example, we have our first chord here, and if you approach reading it from bottom to top, the bottom note is right next to our landmark F. If you're not sure what that means, refer to these videos. And so we're right above our landmark F. That means we're on G. And then I want you to start thinking about intervals. The way that I would approach it is the distance from the bottom to the next note is a third, and the distance from that middle note to the top note is a fourth. And so don't forget that we count intervals inclusively. So first, second, third is that middle note, and then up another fourth. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4 is your top note. So even though there are a lot of ledger lines here, you can still find your way fairly quickly if you're using intervals, because you're just looking at the distance from one note to the next note and from the distance from that note to the next note. And that will help you really quickly find those notes instead of thinking, oh gosh, okay, G, and then, what's that? I think it's a B, and then, ooh, we have these ledger lines, that's very scary. It helps remove that overwhelm. If you learn to just put your blinders on and don't let all of the scary looking things distract you, you can actually figure this out really quickly. So you have this first chord, and then there are two ways that you can approach finding the next chord. You can either first notice the notes that stay the same and the notes that change. So the top note stays the same. Hope you can maybe see that fairly quickly. And then each of those bottom notes move down. And don't forget that we are in E minor, which means that we have F sharp. So unless it's marked otherwise, all of our Fs are F sharp. And then without even needing to name those notes, you're able to find every single one. So if you see, this is my first chord, the bottom two notes step down, ooh, there's an F, that means it's F sharp, you've got your note. And so I want you to try walking through the entire left hand using this style of reading. Using intervals to help you find the initial chord, and then using the motion of every single note in between to find which notes are changing. Then halfway through the next measure, for example, that E drops down to E flat, everything else stays the same. Next measure, the top two stay the same, and that F sharp is naturaled out, so we have a regular F. And then the two bottom ones stay, thumb slides down, the E flat goes down to D. Then that's just for one beat. On the fourth beat, the outer notes stay the same and the one in the middle changes, and so on. So hopefully you can see how it's a lot of notes, and if you need to identify every single note every single time, it's going to slow down your reading a lot. Try working really slowly through the left hand using this system of reading, of finding your initial chord and then figuring out how the other notes are sort of fluctuating around that. You can, of course, use the same system to find every single chord that we use to find the first chord. So for example, if you're starting measure 2 and you don't think about, okay, which notes are in common and how are the other notes moving, you can still figure out pretty quickly, okay, this bottom note is F sharp, and then it's up a third, 1, 2, 3, and then it's up a fifth, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and find your chord that way. It's a bit slower, so I would really encourage you to, if you've never tried using this system of reading, if you've ever heard me talking about this style of reading, and you've only been trying to use it with simple melodies and you think, it's not that different. It doesn't make that much of a difference. It's not that big of a deal. When all of a sudden you need to find 3 notes at once or even 4 notes at once, all of a sudden it is a big deal, and it does make a big difference. So give it a try. This is your first exercise for this piece. You do not have to work all the way through the piece. I know I said go through the entire left hand this way. At some point, yes, but if you want to start with just 2 or 3 measures using this style of reading and getting used to it, that's also totally fair. The next thing that might give you some trouble with this piece is that we have a lot of chords and they need to be fairly quiet, but they're always repeating, and the notes need to come exactly together. And something that's very common, even among advanced pianists, is that We don't always get all of the notes from a chord to play at the same time. Sometimes one note, sometimes the notes don't quite fall really nice and clean together. And then on top of being quiet and a lot of notes all at once, we're also in a slow tempo. And that's much more difficult to control than if we were to play this entire pattern quickly, for example. What do we do? How do we approach this? This is an example of why it's so important to be using our arm weight when we're playing. Because if you're trying to play these chords just with your fingers, that's typically when we're going to run into this sort of issue that the notes aren't quite falling at the same time, because the hand just has such teeny tiny muscles and the fingers have really small muscles, and getting them to really coordinate is difficult. But if you approach it, if the motion is coming from your arm, then you have bigger muscles involved and you're actually going to have more control, because the entire hand is going to go down at the same time, and those fingers are waiting to receive the weight of the arm, and your arm is the one that has the control of the chord actually. You can even, don't worry about being quiet in the beginning. That's your exercise. I want you to find the notes and then lift your arm and then drop it down, and get used to the fingers are catching the weight. And if you play in this way, the notes will always come together every single time. It's when the fingers are doing too much of the work that we have this brrr, sort of like a drum roll, instead of all of the notes exactly together. So you don't need to do this exercise a lot. There are two ways you can approach this. So the one is to really just drop your arm on that chord, find the notes, and then trust that your fingers know where they're returning to. That's one way. The other way is actually what I showed you when I was giving the example of it's easier to play it quickly. I want you to play at least a couple of measures at a time, at least 4 times as fast as you would usually play that left hand, because that's also going to teach you the sort of movement that's going to teach the hand the coordination that you need there. And then from there, you're just slowing it down and stretching it back out. And that's somehow easier. If you've learned how to coordinate the movement, even if it's much faster, you're going to have an easier time accomplishing that when it's slower and when it's quieter. If you do these exercises early on, you're going to have a much simpler time keeping this style of playing. It's going to help you develop that coordination of playing all of those notes together. And then it's not necessarily an exercise that you're going to have to come back to, but it is an exercise that you have in your back pocket. If you ever realize, oof, that's not quite sticking together like it used to, then just come back to these 2 exercises, work on them for a few days, bring them back into your practice routine, and that'll solve your problem. Last but not least, this piece is a beautiful example of one of the greatest challenges of piano playing, and that is most of the time we have one single note that's our melody that needs to really sing out above everything else, and all of those other notes that we need to be worried about and that need to line up so beautifully and that we need to master and understand. We put in all of that work and it somehow has to stay in the background. And it's so difficult to get the brain to say, okay, you be loud, you be quiet. Especially when the melody is just one note and the left hand has 3 or even 4 notes up against that one note. And the lower notes on the piano tend to be much louder just automatically because the strings are longer and fatter, and that means they have more resonance, and that just with the same amount of weight and speed, which is how we determine dynamics, it's automatically louder. So what do we do? If you've been around here very long, you've probably heard me talk about ghosting, and ghosting is just like real life magic. What you're going to do is you're going to play in a very extremely slow tempo, because it looks easy sometimes, but it's actually extremely complicated to manage. You're going to play the melody, so in this case the right hand, completely normally, and The left hand, the accompaniment, is I want you to play, I want you to press the keys, I want them to go down, but with no sound coming out, hence ghosting. So you're playing like a ghost just on the surface of the keys. And by having this really exaggerated experience of the right hand playing and the left hand trying to play but not being allowed to play anything, or not, that we don't want the sound to come out. Once you go back to playing regularly hands together, you've developed this control. And you don't have to do the whole piece with ghosting all at once. Anyway, I would recommend doing this just in small chunks. So if you're just starting this piece, maybe take just the first 2 measures and work on it with ghosting, and go really, really slow, because it is harder than it looks. You can absolutely manage to do this. That's not an issue, but you have to go slow enough. So we have... and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and that's enough. You can do just a small excerpt like that, and it's great if you manage to get the right notes while you do that. You want the right fingering, and it's also okay if a few notes pop out here and there. It's completely normal that the left hand, that a few of them will sound and we'll hear them. It's not the end of the world. You'll still get the benefit of the exercise, as long as it's not every single note on every single beat in the left hand that's coming out. Then you're not really accomplishing much. But I promise you, if you do that exercise from the beginning, you're going to develop this beautiful sense of melody in the right hand, and the left hand will be exactly this beautiful atmospheric thing, but in the background. Because if it's not in the background, it's not atmospheric anymore. It's very present in the room. Because a lot of the time when we learn this piece, we start, and the left hand is too loud. The melody gets buried a little bit, but what we really want is this nice clear melody. And this trick will help you develop that skill early on, and really just keep refining all of your musical ideas as you approach learning this piece. As always, thank you for your time. Thank you for joining me. I hope you found this tutorial helpful. If you have any other questions, if you have any requests for other tutorials, drop them in the comments below. I'm always brainstorming new ideas, and this content is for you. I'm making this for you. So please don't hesitate to ask for things that you're really interested in learning and that you want to be working on, because I am here to help you enjoy your journey at the piano and help you learn the tools that you need in order to be making progress. As always, until next time, happy practicing.